So the idea that, there's no distinction between a CEO and a psychopath, it's like, that's only made by someone who A, knows nothing about psychopaths, B, knows nothing about CEOs, and C, has something fundamental against the entire capitalist structure, because it's simply not true. Corrupt, sometimes, greedy, sometimes, short-sighted, sometimes running companies that are doing their best to auger themselves into the ground, and so, it's bad people running a dying organization. But generally speaking, it's not the case. Our hierarchies of competence are reasonably functional. And not only are they functional, they're valuable. We need to know who the competent people are, and we need to reward them. And even more importantly, we need to tell young people, hey, there's some hierarchies of competence out there. Like 1,000 of them. Go be a plumber, man. But be a good one, Be an honest one. I had a plumber once, It was the night before we were putting drywall in our house. We were redoing a house, and he had put in all the plastic piping, and I was going to test the joints. They're supposed to be glued together with this pipe glue, right? And I told him I had to test the joints, and he said, well, you don't have to test my joints, they never leak. And I thought, yeah, that's okay. How about if I test them? So I went up on the 3rd floor and filled the pipes with water, capping them in the basement like you're supposed to. And like half an hour later, I had 2 inches of water in the basement. There were 30 leaking joints. And that was the night before the drywallers were supposed to show up. So he wasn't particularly competent. That's the point of that story. But even more so, he had put a bunch of the plastic pipe outside where the drywall would be. So it would have been sticking through the wall. So I spent a frenetic night, sawing through plastic pipe and re-gluing joints so that the drywallers could come in. What's the point? If you're going to be a plumber, man, be a good plumber. Because otherwise all you do is go out there and cause trouble. We don't need people to cause more trouble. We need people to solve problems. And so you can be a tradesman, and you can make a lot of money as a tradesperson. It's a bloody, reliable, honorable, forthright, productive way of making a living. And there is a hell of a lot of difference between a working man who knows what he's doing and one who doesn't, both in terms of skill and ethics, right? And you work with someone who knows what they're doing, it's a bloody pleasure. They tell you what they're going to do, they tell you how much it will cost, they go and do it, it works, and you pay them. Perfect. Everyone's happy. And that's what happens when you have genuine hierarchies of competence. And so you listen to these panderers of egalitarianism and equity, and they fail to recognize completely that there are differences in rank between people. It's not such a terrible thing, man. Maybe you wouldn't be a great lawyer. Like, it's certainly possible. Most people aren't. But that doesn't mean there isn't something you could be great at. There's lots of hierarchies to attempt to climb, and if you fail in one, go try in another. But the point is, you're still trying to aim for the top, and what the hell are you going to do if you don't try to aim for the top? Flap about uselessly and whine about your life? It's not helpful. It'll just make you miserable. You're not reliable to anyone. You can't help out in a crisis. It's like, so you tell young people, and this is another message for conservatives, like, I don't care what you're going to do, but go out there and make something of yourself. Be an honest person and work and get to the top of whatever it is that you want to get to the top of. And stand up for yourself like a respectable human being, and be a bit of a light on the world instead of a blight. And you can tell young people that, and they haven't been told that by anyone now. And so the young men are so hungry for that it's painful to watch. They're so relieved when someone finally comes up and says, hey, you get your act together a bit, discipline yourself, see if you can learn to tell the truth, concentrate on something for a year or two, you could be a bloody world beater. They think, really? That's possible? Wow, that would be interesting. That might make life worth living. It's like, yeah, it might. So why don't you go do it? That's what the damn universities were supposed to be teaching people, and they've forgotten that. It's like, get yourself educated, man. Read some books, learn to talk, learn to think, make yourself into something. Get the hell out there and make the world that put you here happy that you were put there. So hierarchies of competence are desirable, and they should be promoted. So none of this idiot egalitarian equity. It's not good for anyone. First of all, it's impossible. Second, it would be murderous to impose. But third, even if it succeeded, it would fail. As fast as it succeeded, that would be how fast it would fail. Why would you strive for anything if there was no up to strive for? If everything's flat and equal, well, when you're starving or dying, then everyone's equal. And believe me, the egalitarian the egalitarian totalitarians who dominated the 20th century knew perfectly well how to make people equal, and they made them equal in gulag work camps and in starvation, and I'm sure we could attain that if we wanted to. So, all right, next, borders are reasonable. How about that?
In your role as CEO of a corporation, you are compelled to maximize profit and to ignore what economists call externalities, that is, the impact of your transactions on others. Well, that's why we have repeated financial crises ever since Reagan and Thatcher. The deregulation of the financial institutions means that the people who run them have to ignore what's called systemic risk, the risk that a transaction is going to bring down the system. And since you ignore it, you're increasing the probability of it, and therefore it repeatedly happens. So we repeatedly have financial crises, each one worse than the last.
In your view, what's wrong with private ownership of the means of production?
We should not have relations of hierarchy, dominance, subordination, centralized control over the means of life, people who give orders and others take them.
Applies all that?
Yeah.
How?
I mean, if you have private ownership of the means of production, it means that, first of all, the people, it's not just one person, it's a institution, so you get like, maybe it's a corporation or private business or something. First of all, internally, it's essentially a totalitarian institution, almost necessarily. There's a group at the top, maybe a person or a group, they make the decisions, they give orders, people down the hierarchy get the orders, transmit them. At the very bottom, you get people who are permitted to rent themselves to survive. That's called a job, wage labor. And you get the outside community who's allowed to purchase what you produce, and of course they're very heavily propagandized to make them want to consume it even if they don't. So I mean, that's the nature of the system. It's kind of about as close to totalitarianism as you can imagine.
I mean, everyone who went to college learned the first paragraph of Wealth of Nations, in which he talks about how wonderful division of labor is, you know, allows for all kind of efficiency and productivity and so on. Not very many people got to page, you know, whatever it is, page 400, in which he points out that division of labor is monstrous because it turns people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a person can possibly be. It's a person who just becomes a machine, and that's a terrible attack on fundamental human rights. And therefore, he says, in any civilized society, the government is going to have to intervene to prevent division of labor. How many people get that far? You know? In fact, Smith does give arguments for markets, rather nuanced arguments. One of the features of contemporary economic systems is what's called imposing flexibility in labor markets. That's considered a wonderful thing. Labor markets are supposed to be flexible. It's a fancy way of saying you don't know when you go to sleep at night whether you have a job tomorrow morning. And that contributes to efficiency. Anybody who's taken an economics course understands that you get more efficiency if people have no security. They don't know what's going to happen to them tomorrow. And then you can move them around. It's just like a tool. So if you can get labor market flexibility, then you get a kind of efficiency, but of course it has a cost. For example, one of the costs is mental illness. The International Labor Organization just did a study in which they found that the incidence of mental illness among workers has increased very sharply, which they attribute plausibly to workers' insecurity. On the other hand, you can look at this as a gain. So like when Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve, tells Congress about what a wonderful economy he's running, he attributes a good part of it to what he calls growing worker insecurity, because then people can't they're afraid to ask for better wages or more benefits, and profits go up and inflation stays down, and you get a fairy tale economy except for the population. But you know, they're tools of production and units of consumption, so they're doing their job if that's what they do.
think the great question of not only practical politics but of political theory is how do you balance the needs of liberty and equality, because those two impulses always seem to be in conflict. Conservatism would put sort of an extreme emphasis on individual liberty and sort of neglect equality. And liberals, you could argue, probably want a little bit of both, and radicals, whether anarchists, communists, or socialists, would in some sense lean more toward equality over liberty. I'm just curious to know from you, how do you think, first off, do you think there is a tension between liberty and equality? And secondly, how do we best create a society that balances those two tensions?
The idea that there's a conflict between them is ideological dogma. We don't know that there's a conflict between them. And in fact, classical liberals didn't think there was. So take, say, Adam Smith, who we're supposed to revere but not read. One of his core arguments for markets, he had rather nuanced arguments for markets, but one of the basic ones was that, as he said, in a free society, markets will lead to equality. And he meant equality of outcome.
Not equality of opportunity.
No, he meant equality of outcome, which he took for granted to be a desideratum. Well, that was one of his core arguments for markets. Under particular social and economic conditions, you get different results. But I don't think there's anything general that can be said about this.
Well, I was going to say, because Adam Smith, and I actually did read my Adam Smith, one of the reasons he believed in markets was because he was anti-monopoly, and that he viewed, these concentrations of power as inherently dangerous to liberty. Is that accurate?
That's correct, and he was opposed to mercantilist structures, which have been reconstructed in many ways in modern corporations. Yeah, he was strongly opposed to that. In fact, when the modern corporation was introduced by state power about a century ago, classical liberals, conservatives as they were often called, bitterly condemned it as a return to feudalism.